They find him over a mailbox, a simple upgrade to replace an old, rusted relic. The HOA, led by the domineering Caroline Henderson, declared it non-compliant and issued a demand: replace it within a week or face escalating fines. When Jack Miller tried to reason, Caroline's response was ice cold. Rules are rules. Don't like it, too bad. What she didn't know was that Jack wasn't one to back down. As he dug deeper, he uncovered secrets within the HOA that threatened to unravel Caroline's iron grip on the community. What began with a mailbox turned into a battle that no one saw coming. But first, let's rewind. Jack Miller was a man of routine and simple joys. Every morning, he'd step outside his modest yet beautifully maintained suburban home with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, ready to collect the mail. His neighborhood was picturesque, with neatly trimmed lawns and tree-lined streets that gave it a postcard-perfect charm. But, like every place, it had its quirks and its problems. Jack's mailbox, a relic from the home's original construction, had seen better days. It leaned slightly to one side, the paint was peeling, and the door creaked ominously every time it opened. For months, Jack's wife, Emily, had been nudging him to replace it, and his kids had even joined the chorus, joking about how their friends teased them about the ancient artifact outside their house. Jack resisted for a while, not because he didn't care, but because life always seemed to get in the way. Work deadlines, school events, and the ever-growing to-do list left little time for what seemed like a minor detail. But one Saturday morning, as the sun streamed through the blinds, Jack finally decided to act. He spent hours browsing online and eventually settled on a sleek, modern design. It was sturdy, elegant, and perfectly complemented the house's aesthetic. Over the weekend, he installed the new mailbox himself, taking pride in the fact that it stood tall and straight, a stark contrast to its predecessor. Emily and the kids were thrilled. Even neighbors walking by complimented the upgrade, with one elderly gentleman quipping, "Now that's a mailbox fit for royalty." For a brief moment, Jack felt a sense of accomplishment, a rare triumph in the midst of life's chaos. That is, until the letter arrived. It was a crisp white envelope with the bold HOA logo stamped on the front. Jack initially assumed it was some routine notice, perhaps about lawn maintenance or an upcoming neighborhood meeting. But as he read the letter, his brow furrowed, and the color drained from his face. The letter was a formal warning from the Homeowners Association. According to them, Jack's new mailbox was in violation of neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. The notice demanded that he replace it within 7 days or face a $50 fine. Jack reread the letter, disbelief quickly giving way to irritation. Violation? Are they serious? Jack muttered under his breath as he handed the letter to Emily. She read it with equal disbelief before shaking her head. "It's just a mailbox," she said, "and it's better than most of the ones on this street." Jack nodded, but deep down, he felt the stirrings of something more profound. It wasn't just about the mailbox, it was about fairness, about being singled out for something that didn't even seem to break the rules. Still, Jack decided to approach the situation diplomatically. After all, he wasn't the kind of man to jump into a fight without first trying to resolve things peacefully. On Monday, he called the number listed in the letter and was greeted by the curt voice of Caroline Henderson, the HOA president. Caroline was infamous in the neighborhood for her rigid adherence to the rules and her overbearing personality. She didn't so much as greet Jack before launching into a rehearsed tirade about community standards and preserving the neighborhood's charm. "Ms. Henderson," Jack interrupted as politely as he could, "I reviewed the HOA guidelines before choosing the mailbox. It's compliant in size, color, and design. I don't understand why this is an issue." "It's non-standard," Caroline snapped. "And non-standard mailboxes disrupt the uniformity of our community. I trust you'll take the appropriate action, Mr. Miller." Jack tried to argue his case, pointing out that several other houses had unique mailboxes, some far more flamboyant than his modest design. But Caroline wouldn't budge. She ended the call abruptly, leaving Jack holding the phone in frustration. It would have been easy to comply, to replace the mailbox and move on. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. Why him? Why now? And why was Caroline so intent on enforcing a rule that didn't seem to exist? The next day, Jack decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand. He noted the variety of mailboxes, some painted in bright colors, others with whimsical designs that clearly deviated from any so-called standard. He snapped photos and jotted down addresses, building a case for what he now saw as selective enforcement. As the week went on, Jack began to notice subtle changes in his interactions with neighbors. Some avoided eye contact or hurried inside when he approached. Others offered him quiet words of support, expressing their own frustrations with the HOA's heavy-handedness. It was clear that Caroline's influence extended far beyond mailboxes. She ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, and most residents were too afraid of retaliation to push back. By Friday, the deadline in the letter had arrived, and Jack still hadn't replaced the mailbox. That evening, he received another letter from the HOA, this time notifying him of a $50 fine for non-compliance. Jack crumpled the letter in his hand, anger bubbling to the surface. Enough was enough. He didn't sleep much that night, his mind racing with questions. Why was the HOA targeting him? What gave Caroline the right to wield so much power? And most importantly, how could he fight back? As the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, Jack made a decision. He wouldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about the mailbox anymore. It was about standing up for himself, for his family, and for everyone in the neighborhood who felt powerless against the HOA's arbitrary rules. Little did Caroline know, Jack Miller wasn't the kind of man to back down. The mailbox might have sparked the fire, but what was coming next would shake the very foundation of her control. Saturday morning dawned bright and quiet, but Jack Miller's house was anything but peaceful. He sat at the dining table, surrounded by a growing stack of papers, printouts of HOA guidelines, photos of non-compliant mailboxes in the neighborhood, and even a few legal articles he'd found online. His wife, Emily, watched him from across the room, a mix of concern and admiration on her face. "Are you sure about this, Jack?" she asked, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "I mean, it's just a mailbox. Is it really worth all this trouble?" Jack looked up, determination etched into his expression. "It's not just about the mailbox, Em. It's about how they're treating us, how they're treating everyone. Someone has to push back." He wasn't alone in thinking that. Over the past week, Jack had quietly started speaking to neighbors who'd had run-ins with Caroline Henderson in the HOA. Some were hesitant to talk, fearing retaliation, but others opened up. Stories poured in about unfair fines, arbitrary rule changes, and Caroline's intimidating tactics. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Linda, recounted how Caroline had fined her for planting roses in her front yard because they weren't community approved. Another man, a young father, shared how he was forced to repaint his house after Caroline claimed the color was too vibrant, despite it being on the HOA's approved list. Each story fueled Jack's resolve. This wasn't about maintaining neighborhood standards. It was about control. And Caroline seemed to thrive on wielding it over anyone who dared to step out of line. Jack's first move was to appeal the fine. He sent a formal letter to the HOA board, outlining his case with meticulous detail. He included photos of other non-standard mailboxes in the neighborhood, highlighted sections of the guidelines that supported his design, and even attached a receipt showing that his mailbox was purchased from a supplier recommended by the HOA itself. The response came swiftly and predictably. Caroline rejected the appeal outright, stating that the mailbox violated the spirit of the community's aesthetic vision. It was a phrase so vague it could have meant anything, or nothing at all. Jack wasn't surprised, but he was angry, and he wasn't about to let it end there. By Monday, Jack had taken his fight to the next level. Armed with a clipboard and a notebook, he went door to door, talking to neighbors and gathering signatures for a petition. His goal was simple: to demand a review of the HOA's rules and to hold Caroline accountable for her actions. At first, the responses were mixed. Some neighbors were eager to sign, expressing relief that someone was finally standing up to the HOA. Others were hesitant, worried about drawing Caroline's ire. One woman, a young mother named Sarah, hesitated at first but eventually relented. "Honestly, Jack, I'm scared of what she'll do if she finds out I signed this," she admitted, glancing nervously down the street. "She fined me $200 last year for having a trampoline in the backyard. My kids loved it, but we couldn't afford to keep it." Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. If we all stand together, she can't bully us anymore." Little by little, the signatures added up. By the end of the week, Jack had over 50 names, more than enough to force the HOA to hold a special meeting. But Caroline wasn't about to let him win without a fight. The following day, Jack found a bright red notice taped to his front door. In bold letters, it declared that he was in violation of multiple HOA rules, including unauthorized solicitation and disruptive behavior. The notice threatened additional fines and even hinted at legal action if he didn't cease his activities immediately. Jack stared at the paper, his hands trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Emily appeared beside him, reading over his shoulder. "This is insane," she said, her voice shaking. "How can they do this?" "They can't," Jack said firmly. "Not legally anyway. This is just another one of Caroline's scare tactics." But the notice had its intended effect. Several neighbors who'd signed the petition called Jack to say they were withdrawing their support. Some apologized profusely, while others simply said they couldn't risk it. Jack understood their fear, but it only deepened his resolve. Caroline was clearly afraid of losing her grip on the neighborhood, and that meant Jack was on the right track. That evening, Jack sat down with Emily to strategize. "If they want to play hardball, so will I," he said, spreading out his notes on the table. "I'm going to request a copy of the HOA's financial records. Legally, they have to provide them to any member who asks." Emily nodded, though worry flickered in her eyes. "Just be careful, Jack. You're pushing a lot of buttons." "Good," Jack said. "It's about time someone did." The next morning, he submitted a formal request for the financial records, citing the HOA bylaws. He suspected that Caroline's actions weren't just about enforcing rules. They were about maintaining control. If there was anything suspicious in the finances, it could explain a lot. As Jack waited for a response, he continued to rally support from the neighbors who hadn't backed down. They began sharing their own stories publicly, posting on social media, and even reaching out to local reporters. The neighborhood was abuzz with talk of the brewing rebellion, and Caroline's once unquestioned authority started to show cracks. But Jack knew the fight was far from over. Caroline was a master manipulator, and she wasn't going to let go of her power without a fight. What Jack didn't know was just how far she was willing to go to stop him. By the following week, Jack's fight against the HOA had become the talk of the neighborhood. Some residents whispered about his bravery, while others criticized him for stirring up trouble. But one thing was clear: Caroline Henderson was not happy. Her iron grip on the community was slipping, and she wasn't about to let that happen without a battle. Jack's request for the HOA's financial records had gone unanswered, which was a direct violation of the organization's bylaws. Frustrated but undeterred, he decided to escalate. With the help of a neighbor, Linda, a retired paralegal, Jack drafted a letter warning the HOA that their refusal to provide the records could result in legal action. The letter was clear, concise, and delivered directly to Caroline's mailbox. 3 days later, a response arrived, though it wasn't what Jack expected. Instead of the financial records, he received a letter from the HOA's attorney. The letter accused Jack of harassment, defamation, and inciting division within the community. It threatened a lawsuit if he didn't stop his campaign of disruption. Jack read the letter aloud to Emily, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," Emily said, pacing the living room. "They're trying to scare you into backing down." Jack folded the letter and set it on the table. "They're bluffing. They have to be. If they had a real case, they wouldn't need to resort to this." But the letter had its intended effect on some of Jack's supporters. A few neighbors quietly withdrew their signatures from the petition, fearful of becoming targets themselves. The momentum Jack had worked so hard to build was faltering, and Caroline seized the opportunity. Over the next week, Caroline launched an all-out assault on Jack's credibility. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, accusing him of spreading misinformation and threatening the community's harmony. She hosted an emergency HOA meeting, framing it as a discussion about restoring unity in the neighborhood. Jack wasn't invited, of course, but Linda attended and later told him what had happened. "She painted you as some kind of troublemaker," Linda said, shaking her head. "She even claimed you were planning to sue the HOA just to bankrupt it. It's absurd, but some people are buying it." Jack felt a knot of frustration tightening in his chest. He wasn't trying to hurt the community. He was trying to protect it. But Caroline was a skilled manipulator, and she knew how to play on people's fears. Still, Jack refused to give up. If anything, Caroline's antics only strengthened his resolve. That weekend, Jack organized a community gathering at his house. He invited everyone who'd been affected by the HOA's overreach, encouraging them to share their stories. At first, the turnout was small, just a handful of neighbors huddled around Jack's living room. But as word spread, more people showed up, until the room was filled with voices recounting their own experiences. One elderly couple shared how Caroline had fined them for leaving their trash bins out too long, despite the bins being moved within the required time frame. A young mother tearfully described how she'd been forced to remove a swing set from her backyard after Caroline claimed it was an eyesore. Even a former HOA board member spoke up, revealing how Caroline had pressured him to approve questionable fines and rule changes. By the end of the night, the group had reached a unanimous decision. They would no longer be silent. Jack and Linda drafted a collective letter to the local newspaper detailing the HOA's abuses of power and calling for greater oversight. The letter was published the following week, sparking a wave of public interest. Caroline's response was swift and aggressive. Within days, she issued another fine to Jack, this time for violating community noise ordinances during the gathering. The fine was baseless, of course, but it was a clear message. Caroline wasn't backing down. Jack, however, had his own surprise in store. Earlier that week, Linda had reached out to a local journalist who specialized in investigative reporting. The journalist, intrigued by the growing controversy, began digging into the HOA's records. With Jack's help, they uncovered a pattern of questionable financial practices, inflated expenses, missing funds, and payments to contractors with ties to Caroline's family. The journalist's exposé was published just days after Jack received the noise violation fine. The article laid out the evidence in painstaking detail, highlighting how Caroline had allegedly funneled HOA funds into her own projects while using intimidation tactics to silence dissent. It was a bombshell, and it sent shockwaves through the community. As the article spread, neighbors who had been reluctant to speak out began coming forward. Caroline's support base crumbled, and calls for her resignation grew louder. But even as the walls closed in around her, Caroline refused to step down. Instead, she doubled down on her attacks against Jack, accusing him of orchestrating a smear campaign. One evening, Jack received an anonymous note in his mailbox. It read, "Watch your back. You don't know who you're messing with." Jack showed the note to Emily, who looked genuinely frightened. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "Maybe it's time to let it go." But Jack couldn't. The fight had become about more than just a mailbox or even the HOA. It was about standing up to a bully, about showing his neighbors that they didn't have to live in fear. As he looked at the note, a grim determination settled over him. "I'm not letting her win," he said. "Not this time." The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Jack planned to attend. This time, he wasn't coming alone. With Linda's help, he'd gathered signatures from over 70% of the homeowners in the neighborhood, enough to call for a vote of no confidence in Caroline's leadership. He also had copies of the financial evidence uncovered by the journalist, ready to present to the board. The stage was set for a showdown, and Jack knew it wouldn't be easy. But he also knew one thing for certain. The truth was on his side, and Caroline's reign of terror was nearing its end. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and Jack could feel the tension in the air as he walked into the community center. The usually quiet room was packed, with nearly every seat taken and people standing along the walls. Whispers filled the space as neighbors exchanged nervous glances. Some offered Jack encouraging smiles, while others avoided his gaze, unsure of how the evening would unfold. Caroline Henderson sat at the head of the room, her posture stiff and her expression stern. Dressed in her usual power suit, she exuded an air of confidence, but Jack could see the faint cracks in her demeanor. She had read the exposé, heard the whispers, and seen the growing support for Jack. Tonight, she was cornered, and Jack knew it. The meeting began as usual, with Caroline rattling off routine updates about landscaping budgets and upcoming neighborhood events. But as she tried to move quickly through the agenda, Jack raised his hand. "I'd like to address an item not currently listed," he said, his voice steady but firm. Caroline's lips tightened into a thin line. "Mr. Miller, this meeting has a set agenda. If you have concerns, you can submit them in writing." "I already have," Jack replied, holding up a copy of his petition. "And I have the signatures of over 70% of the homeowners here requesting a vote of no confidence in your leadership." The room erupted into murmurs. Caroline's face flushed red, but she forced a strained smile. "Let's maintain order," she snapped, her voice rising. "Mr. Miller, these theatrics are highly inappropriate." "It's not theatrics," Jack shot back, stepping forward. "It's the will of the community. We've had enough of the fines, the intimidation, and the misuse of power. And if you won't step down, we're prepared to vote you out tonight." Caroline's composure cracked as the murmurs grew louder. Several neighbors stood up, voicing their support for Jack. Others shared their own grievances, recounting stories of unfair fines and arbitrary rules. Caroline tried to regain control, banging her gavel and demanding silence, but the room had turned against her. When the noise subsided, Jack continued. "I have here a detailed account of questionable financial practices under your leadership," he said, holding up a folder. "Funds that were misallocated, payments made to your family's businesses, and expenses that don't add up. These records have been reviewed by an investigative journalist and are now public knowledge." Caroline's face turned a deeper shade of red. "These accusations are baseless," she spat. "You're spreading lies to smear my reputation." Jack opened the folder and began reading from the documents. He detailed inflated landscaping costs, payments for projects that were never completed, and an unexplained $15,000 expense for consulting fees paid to a company registered under Caroline's brother's name. As he spoke, gasps rippled through the crowd, and more people began to murmur angrily. Linda, who had been sitting quietly in the front row, stood up and addressed the room. "As a former paralegal, I can confirm that these findings raise serious legal and ethical concerns. This isn't just about bad leadership, it's about potential fraud." Caroline's voice shook as she tried to defend herself. "These are complex financial matters that you clearly don't understand. I've done nothing wrong, and everything was approved by the board." "Then why did you refuse to provide the financial records when I requested them?" Jack countered. "If everything is above board, why the secrecy?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Caroline. For a moment she looked as though she might lash out, but then she slumped back in her chair, realizing the tide had fully turned against her. The vote of no confidence was swift and decisive. Out of the homeowners present, more than 80% voted to remove Caroline from her position as HOA president. The board, clearly rattled by the revelations, announced that an independent audit of the HOA's finances would begin immediately. Caroline stormed out of the room before the meeting ended, her head held high but her steps unsteady. As the crowd began to disperse, neighbors approached Jack to thank him. Sarah, the young mother who had hesitated to sign the petition, hugged him tightly. "You did it," she said, tears in her eyes. "You gave us our voices back." Jack smiled, though he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. It had been a long, grueling fight, but it was worth it. The neighborhood was no longer under Caroline's control, and the community had taken its first steps toward rebuilding trust and fairness. In the weeks that followed, the independent audit confirmed the financial discrepancies Jack had uncovered. Caroline was officially charged with embezzlement and banned from holding any position within the HOA. The new board implemented stricter oversight measures, ensuring that no one person could ever wield so much power again. As for Jack, he became a quiet hero in the neighborhood. His mailbox remained standing, a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for what's right. One evening, as he sat on his porch with Emily, watching the sunset over the street, she nudged him playfully. "All this over a mailbox," she said with a smile. Jack chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. "It was never just about the mailbox," he replied. "It was about standing up to bullies and winning." And in that moment, as the neighborhood settled into a newfound peace, Jack knew he had done the right thing.